It is Sunday night and time for our regular look at the week ahead. Tonight, our focus is a global report on torture scheduled to be released by Amnesty International on Tuesday. Despite almost universal condemnation of torture, many people are still subjected to it, and many survivors have to struggle to overcome the trauma. We begin with this report from Courtney Keeley.
14 men from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi sing to celebrate their bond after 10 weeks of counseling and therapy at a center in Nairobi, Kenya. One survivor wrote the refrain they sing, "Don't lose hope, stand firm, and stop torture." They continue to meet as the Tumaini Self-Support Group. Tumaini means hope in Swahili. The Center for Victims of Torture provided the therapy and medical treatments.
These rehabilitation centers are places of hope.
Kurt Gehring oversees the center's projects in the U.S., Africa, and the Middle East.
Survivors and victims of torture are able to rebuild and recover.
Experts like Gehring say torture is still being carried out in more than 100 countries.
There is no category that's spared. There are men, women, and unfortunately, and especially in the case of Syria, I think, increasingly children. Almost half the torture survivors that our staff in Jordan see, the survivors from Syria, are children now. So not even kids are spared.
We were granted an interview with a survivor who has political asylum and is studying to be a scientist, but he was afraid of being on camera even in complete shadow. He feared that the smallest identifying detail could tip off informers here who would tell security officials back home, who would then go after his family. We've also disguised his voice.
I have been a victim of torture for like almost 2 years. Sometimes when I just want to think about it, it makes me cry or cause me a lot of pain, distress. I feel like I'm completely desolate. I have no future because of, sometimes I feel that, I would have been better than experiencing those kind of torture that I went through. As a human being, you learn to forgive, because this is past, it has passed.
The purpose of torture is to really dismantle the person, both physically, emotionally, psychologically, and to lose trust in themselves and lose trust in any other people, in humanity in general.
It's estimated there are 50,000 survivors of torture currently living in the U.S., but only about 5,000 to 6,000 people receive treatment annually in these centers. Courtney Keeley, Al Jazeera, New York.
As we mentioned, Amnesty International is releasing a report on Tuesday detailing the use of torture around the world. Western nations are among those under scrutiny. In the United States, President Obama has been under fire for not closing down the detention center at Guantanamo Bay. He promised to do so during his first campaign. But after he took office, Congress imposed restrictions that made closing the prison much more difficult. And the Senate Intelligence Committee has been at odds with the Central Intelligence Agency after a report was released outlining the agency's secret interrogation programs under the Bush administration. To discuss this issue further, let's talk now to Larry Siems. He's author of the Torture Report. And at Stanford University, Manfred Nowak, formerly UN Rapporteur on torture and internationally known scholar on human rights. Larry, let's start with you. How pervasive is torture around the world?
Well, as they said, there are over 100 countries that are listed in Amnesty's report as being torture-practicing regimes. The difficulty from the point of view of the American position on torture is that the United States has long been a strong advocate against torture. We have been, our State Department publishes an annual human rights report which details the practice of torture in many of these countries. But unfortunately, because of the U.S.'s own post-9/11 rendition, detention, and interrogation program, we ourselves have come under scrutiny for our detention and torture practices, and we have lost a lot of influence, or ability to influence the conduct of other governments.
You mentioned the United Nations Convention Against Torture. In fact, more than 150 countries have signed this Convention Against Torture, but many of these nations still use torture techniques to punish and intimidate prisoners. Manfred, I wonder if you can put in perspective how many still use torture despite having signed to this accord.
When I was UN Special Rapporteur on Torture between 2004 and 2010, I visited 18 countries on official mission, and in 90%, so in actually 17 of the 18 countries, I did find torture, and this was a fairly good sample. So not only the worst countries, from all regions in the world, democratic countries and dictatorships and big and small countries. So I think it is a fairly representative sample. So that means in about 90% of the countries there is some torture, often in isolated cases, but definitely more than half of the countries of the world, torture is a serious problem, widely practiced, sometimes systematically practiced.
Manfred, in your visit to these capitals, did you sense any sort of trend? And there we are again showing the 150 countries around the world who have signed the UN Convention Against Torture. Did you get a trend as to whether or not it's getting better or getting worse?
That's very difficult to answer. In some areas, some countries, it certainly got better. But I am afraid that in the last 10, 15 years, and it also has to do with the so-called war on terror, it got actually worse. When we did a study on secret detention in the fight against terrorism, we found 66 countries, also in Europe, in the Middle East, in Africa, many of them cooperating with the CIA, that use secret detention in the fight against terrorism. And that, of course, also means using torture.
Larry, what has changed in the United States other than President Obama saying we're going to stop the practice? But again, some of the facilities are still there. We understand the CIA still uses certain black sites around the world. What's changed?
Well, I think that the worst period of torture post 9/11 was 2001 until 2005, and a lot of the worst abuses were at least brought under control, partly because there was, or almost entirely because there was enormous dissent inside of the military and in the intelligence agencies. These were still secret practices as far as we knew, and yet inside there was an enormous movement in all of the services to bring these practices back into compliance with international standards. And for that reason, we have quite an enormous documentary record, which really establishes quite clearly what techniques were used and how they violated all of the principles and norms. So in a sense, it was brought under control largely in 2005. The problem is that we have had no accountability process to reflect on what was done and to do what the law requires, which is hold responsible those who carried out these programs and provide some kind of restitution to the victims, and we have not done that at all.
So when the Obama administration, President himself, decided we will not go after anybody in the Bush administration, either at the Justice Department or at the CIA, in your view, that was a mistake?
Well, it is a mistake because we need to, first of all, we need to come to terms with what we did, and we need to at least settle the national debate about whether or not this was torture, whether or not this was effective. The whole back and forth between the Senate Intelligence Committee and the CIA over the Senate Intelligence Committee report, that report is about, it will establish quite clearly for the American people not only what was done, but the fact that it was not effective in the way that the government has continued to say torture was effective in eliciting threat-preventing information or threat-ameliorating information. This information continues to be suppressed, and without that information, we're not able to come to a national consensus that allows us to move forward and restore some of the protections that should be in place.
Since you mentioned that report, which talks about the CIA and the friction, of course, between the Central Intelligence Agency and the Senate Intelligence Committee, I want to put up a graphic that explains to our viewers a little bit what it is. Last month, the Senate Intelligence Committee voted to declassify a report summarizing the CIA's interrogation programs. The 480-page document includes findings from more than 5 years of investigation into the treatment of detainees. The report has sparked a feud between the Senate panel and the CIA. CIA officials say Senate staffers obtained documents that were not cleared for release. The dispute is now under review by the Justice Department. I would assume, Larry, you're hoping the Justice Department says release it.
Well, I think we have to release it. I mean, this is, a lot of the information on which that report draws on is already public through, at least in redacted form, from declassified government documents. I think it's no longer possible to say that the United States didn't violate the Convention Against Torture. The information is there, and many of the people who were inside and fought this thing have spoken very publicly about how this has happened. So I think, just in terms of, we're a democratic country that supposedly proceeds on, on principles of transparency and accountability, and it's simply a matter of preserving and maintaining our national standing to, to move this conversation forward and to release that report.
Manfred, how many of the countries that you have visited have the same tension between political leaders and intelligence agencies in terms of whether torture should be used or not, and how do these disputes usually get resolved?
I mean, it's the same in many other countries, and in particular, since the Bush administration actually used torture methods, also other countries that were closely collaborating with the United States said if the United States of America, who was always the vanguard in the fight for human rights and against torture, if they are even torturing, so why shouldn't we do the same? It's something I heard, for instance, in Jordan, but in many other countries as well. So it's this kind of putting into question the absolute prohibition of torture in the Convention Against Torture in international human rights law. So you have very, very similar discussions in many other countries. But if I may say, of course, the so-called war on terror did a lot to make torture kind of socially acceptable and put the absolute prohibition into question. But if we look at the phenomenon of torture worldwide, this is a very, very small percentage where people are tortured because they were suspected terrorists and to get information from them. More than 90% of all cases of torture around the world that I found have nothing to do with terrorism, nothing to do with intelligence. They are just torture in the ordinary criminal procedure. The police is torturing a suspect for any kind of crime because they have no other or no better ways of interrogating and finding evidence. Of course, we are rightly focusing so much on the US, on intelligence, but I think that the big bulk of torture around the world, in all regions actually, is much more the average, ordinary crime interrogation.
We spoke earlier to Juan Mendez, who's the UN Special Rapporteur on torture, had the job obviously before Manfred did. He explained several obligations that governments have when it comes to the practice of torture. Watch.
Then a third obligation is to offer reparations and rehabilitation services to victims of torture. This is also not very much observed in practice because governments don't identify the victims, and then they pretend that there's nobody to offer reparations to.
Larry, do you get a sense that, torture, we know from so many intelligence agencies, doesn't work? It doesn't provide the accurate information that agencies are looking for, but it's also the practice that torture is sometimes used to essentially punish and inflict harm. What's the divide nowadays that you see around the world?
Well, I think it's both, although I think, as Manfred says, a lot of times it's a matter of poor police work. It's just an expedient way to get a result, to get a conviction, to get a confession. And I think torture is most frequently used to get a confession, to coerce testimony, to coerce a confession. And, it's cheap, it doesn't require, fancy police work, and it's extremely, as I say, extremely expedient. So I think, as Manfred said, that's the majority purpose of it. I think even in the CIA black sites and in Guantanamo, there's some evidence that suggests that the purpose ultimately was not to prevent terrorist attacks, but ultimately to kind of build cases and pretexts for prolonged detention when there really were none. And I think that's the most common purpose of torture.
And during the detention, whether it's for security detainees or whether it's for ordinary prisoners in the United States, a lot of states use solitary confinement. Manfred, is that considered a form of torture, and when does it become torture?
Of course, that's a very difficult question. We have cases when people are kept for 3 years in solitary confinement. This was considered to be torture. For a short period of time, for instance, in pretrial detention, if you need to keep people apart because it's a whole gang that you arrested and you want to find the evidence, for a short period of time, solitary confinement might be legal and also necessary for the criminal investigation. But prolonged forms of torture, in particular, if people are told, prolonged form of solitary confinement, if they are told, I keep you in solitary confinement until you actually confess to the crime or you provide me with the information that I would like to hear from you, then of course this becomes a torture because it is for the purpose of extracting information. So we really have to distinguish, but also what I know from ordinary US prisons, in particular maximum security prisons, people are kept in solitary confinement for a far too long period of time, and that can at least amount to cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment, which is also absolutely prohibited under international law.
Larry, looking ahead, the Amnesty International report comes out on Tuesday. How important is it, and what do you expect the impact to be?
Well, it's enormously important. It should be a real gut check for the United States, I think, that we need to restore, we need to reclaim a leadership position in this because we are influential. To do that, I think we have to look really carefully and do some accounting in our own country for what we've done. I think, you know, there has been the solitary confinement example is a very good one, because I think in the United States there's been a kind of a degradation with our sense of common humanity, with our belief in the dignity of every human being, and it's that belief that underpins the Torture Convention and all of our constitutional protections. Every human being has a right to a minimum standard of humane treatment. And, you know, I think if we need to look at the treatment that we have inflicted on others post 9/11, acknowledge that in some cases it has exceeded those boundaries, do what the law requires, provide restitution for those people, and then begin to, you know, address one another more humanely in the United States as well.
Larry Siems and Manfred Nowak, a fascinating conversation. So glad to have you on tonight. We appreciate you being with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's take a look at some other events that are coming up this week. Monday marks the last day of voting in India's parliamentary elections, which took place in 9 phases. On Thursday, there will be a dedication service held right here in New York for the 9/11 Memorial Museum at Ground Zero. And Saturday marks the 117th running of the Preakness, the second leg of horse racing's Triple Crown.